The CEO nobody noticed. Isaac Marshall moved through the bustling airport terminal, just another face among countless passengers. The aroma of jet fuel and coffee hung in the air as he clutched an economy class ticket, his tailored suit left at home. A man of immense power and influence, today he was merely a traveler, secretly evaluating his airline. He braved subtle indignities, dismissal snarks, but nothing could prepare him for the storm brewing in the cabin. What unfolded next would test not only his resolve, but the values his company claimed to uphold. What would you have done in his shoes? But before we dive deeper into this compelling story, let me know where you're reading from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another one. The airport terminal buzzed with life, a constant hum of activity. Isaac Marshall moved through the crowd, unnoticed, just another face among the sea of passengers. The faint scent of jet fuel mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee in the air, a sensory reminder of the long journey ahead. The announcements from the PA system were routine, delivered in a calm, almost mechanical tone, calling passengers to board flights across the country. Isaac's purpose, however, was far from routine. He wasn't here as a businessman heading to a crucial meeting or a vacationer embarking on a much-needed getaway. His mission was more covert, a test to assess the airline's service without anyone knowing who he was. Isaac's profession, one few would ever imagine him to have, was as the CEO of a global airline, a role that carried immense responsibility. The company he ran had grown exponentially over the years, becoming a household name with destinations worldwide. He was a visionary, known for his sharp business acumen and innovative ideas. But most people didn't know that Isaac's success wasn't built solely on strategies, stock options, or quarterly earnings. It was grounded in his deep belief in fairness, quality, and customer satisfaction. For him, the true measure of an airline's success lay not just in its financials, but in the experience it delivered to its passengers. Today, however, Isaac was not the CEO. Today, he was just another traveler. No one would recognize him, and he preferred it that way. His focus was on discovering the reality of the airline's service from the perspective of an everyday customer. He had left his tailored business attire at home, choosing instead to wear simple, inconspicuous clothes. Blending in as much as possible, he was on a mission to uncover the truth, to see if the promises of excellence the company boasted about were being upheld in practice. As he approached the check-in counter, he observed the usual signs of a busy terminal: passengers rushing to catch flights, the clatter of suitcases on tiled floors, and the low murmur of conversations, punctuated by the familiar sound of ringing cell phones and the tapping of fingers on smartphone screens. Isaac remained composed, his face calm and unreadable. His fingers tightened around the edges of his economy class ticket, the only real indicator of his identity. The line moved forward, and soon he stood before the check-in agent, a young woman with dark hair pulled into a neat bun. She smiled, the practiced look of someone who had seen thousands of passengers like him. Her eyes briefly flickered to the ticket in her hand as she began to scan it, but it was the brief hesitation that caught Isaac's attention. The agent's smile faltered ever so slightly, a fleeting moment that only Isaac noticed. It was enough to signal a small shift in her demeanor. She glanced at his worn, scuffed shoes, out of place for a first-class flyer. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Isaac recognized it. People often judged others based on appearances, assuming who they were by the clothes they wore or the way they carried themselves. Isaac had experienced both sides of this judgment, dressed in impeccable suits for board meetings, and now dressed down to observe without being recognized. The agent cleared her throat, then, with a tight smile, spoke. "Sir, are you sure you wouldn't prefer an upgrade? We have excellent first-class amenities." Her voice had the smooth, rehearsed tone of someone trying to be both polite and persuasive. Isaac smiled back, a small, polite gesture that didn't betray his thoughts. "No, thank you. I'd like to stay in economy today." The agent's smile slipped briefly. just long enough for Isaac to catch a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. It was the smallest of moments, but he knew it well. A silent calculation of who he might be. She quickly recovered, printing out his boarding pass with a few swift movements. As she handed it to him, she added under her breath, loud enough for Isaac to hear, "Strange choice." Isaac didn't flinch, though the words stung more than they should have. He was well aware of how people like her saw him. Someone who didn't belong in economy, someone who should be entitled to the luxuries of a higher class. But that was the point. He was here to see how the airline treated every passenger, not just those who could afford to sit in first class. Later today, Isaac asked Dr. Kaller if he could go over the procedure before another take. As he took the boarding pass, he caught the faintest trace of the agent's eyes flickering to his worn shoes once more, before she quickly looked away. Isaac remained calm, his mind already working through the next phase of his mission. He had plenty of time to observe, to take in the service and details that many passengers might overlook. No one would know who he truly was, and that was precisely what he needed in order to uncover the truth. He moved away from the counter, heading toward the security check. In the distance, he could see the large glass windows and the planes lined up outside, each one a symbol of the company's success. He couldn't afford to let his company become complacent. That was why this hidden mission was so important. Today, he would see how well the airline measured up, and whether the team on board was upholding the values he had fought so hard to establish. If there was a problem, Isaac would address it. If not, he would know his company still had the integrity to back up its promises. For now, though, he simply moved through the terminal, absorbing the sights, sounds, and moments of tension that were yet to come. The boarding gate was a hive of activity, the air thick with the chatter of passengers and the sound of rolling suitcases clattering against the floor. Isaac stood among the crowd, his posture relaxed but his mind alert. Around him, families reunited, colleagues conversed, and travelers checked their boarding passes for the umpteenth time. He, however, was focused on one thing, the next step of his mission. Isaac had been assigned Group C, always the last to board, the final wave of passengers after the privileged first-class flyers and mid-tier economy travelers. It was intentional. He wanted to see how those in the lower ranks of the plane were treated, far from the prying eyes of management and executives. As passengers in Groups A and B made their way onto the aircraft, Isaac felt the tension mounting. The closer he got to boarding, the more keenly aware he became of how invisible, or conversely how scrutinized, he was in his plain clothes. When the announcement for Group C to board was made, Isaac moved forward with the others. The process was methodical, almost mechanical. Yet as he approached the gate, he noticed something. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, a strange current of judgment passing through the crowd. Isaac couldn't immediately identify it, but as he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, the weight of it became undeniable. "Thank you," the agent said, her smile a little too wide as she scanned his ticket. There was no warmth in her eyes, just a practiced politeness that masked something colder. Isaac returned a brief smile, choosing to ignore the momentary pause in her demeanor. He had learned long ago that people often assessed you in ways that weren't visible on the surface. As Isaac made his way down the jet bridge, the hum of conversation from the gate area quickly faded. The stark contrast between the bustling terminal and the calm, confined interior of the plane deepened the tension he had been feeling. He entered the aircraft, the faint scent of disinfectant mixing with the musty smell of upholstered seats and stale air. The low murmur of passengers settled into a soft hum as he moved down the aisle, toward his seat in the back, feeling more and more out of place. That's when he saw her. Carla, the lead flight attendant, stood ahead, welcoming passengers with a professional smile. She was the first person Isaac made eye contact with as he boarded, and it didn't take long for him to notice that her smile, though practiced and polished, didn't quite reach her eyes. As he approached, he saw her glance down at his ticket. Just a brief flicker of hesitation, a momentary pause, but enough for Isaac to pick up on. He had dealt with people like her before, those who assumed too much based on appearances, too quick to judge someone's status. Carla's eyes skimmed him, moving from his face to the ticket in her hand. Then, just for a second, her gaze dropped lower, down to his shoes. Isaac felt the judgment in that split-second glance. It wasn't blatant, but it was there. Her posture straightened, and for a brief moment, a flicker of disapproval passed across her face. But, just as quickly, she masked it with her usual customer service demeanor, as though the moment hadn't happened at all. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, the words sweet, but the tone colder than it should have been, almost as if she were speaking to someone who didn't quite belong. Isaac nodded politely, his mind already calculating how to handle this subtle shift in dynamics. The awkwardness between them hung in the air, thickening the already charged atmosphere. As he moved past her down the aisle, he noticed her gaze following him, her eyes tracing his every step, watching him closely. It wasn't just a casual glance. No, this was something different. Isaac had walked enough in the world of corporate power to recognize the signs. When someone was sizing you up, trying to figure out who you were, or, in this case, who you weren't. He took his seat at the far end of the aisle, settling into the cramped space of the economy section. The seat was uncomfortable, the legroom tight, but he had no intention of getting comfortable today. As he adjusted the straps of his seatbelt, he could feel Carla's presence looming just behind him, her eyes still lingering, almost as if she were waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to do something that would confirm her suspicions. Isaac stared straight ahead, refusing to meet her gaze. He knew how this worked, how the perception of power could sometimes be more important than the actual substance behind it. And Carla had already made her assumptions about him. The question now was, how far would she go with it? The soft murmur of passengers settled into a quiet buzz as everyone took their seats, but Isaac could still feel her watching him. The subtle tension between them seemed to draw a line in the aisle, separating him from the rest of the plane. He was just another anonymous passenger, but it was clear that to Carla, and likely to the other flight attendants, he was something more. End of chapter 5. Carla's eyes flicked back to him one more time, her gaze lingering a fraction too long before she turned away to assist another passenger. But in that split second, Isaac caught a glimmer of something. A challenge, a spark of suspicion that had no place in a professional setting. He wasn't sure what it was exactly, but he could sense it. It was the kind of unspoken scrutiny that some people, particularly those in positions of authority, applied to those they saw as out of place. As the boarding process continued, the discomfort lingered. Isaac could feel the unease in the air, a subtle undercurrent of tension that seemed to ripple through the cabin. It was as if the entire crew had already decided what kind of person he was, even before he had said a word. And, as he sat there, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that were sure to come, he realized that his mission had already begun. Not with a grand reveal, but with these small, insidious moments of judgment. And that, he knew, was where the real challenge lay. Isaac adjusted himself in the cramped economy seat, the fabric of the upholstery rubbing against his back, highlighting the stark contrast between the plush comfort of first class and the harsh reality of the section he now occupied. He leaned back slightly, feeling the edges of the seat press uncomfortably into his sides. The tightness of the space was almost suffocating, a constant reminder of the world he had deliberately chosen to inhabit today. The low hum of conversation filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats, strapping in and preparing for the long flight ahead. Isaac, however, remained detached from it all, his thoughts drifting to the task at hand. His eyes scanned the interior of the aircraft, noting the small details, the worn seat covers, the faded overhead compartments. And yet, his mind was focused on something more pressing. He was here to observe, to understand the reality of what passengers like these were experiencing. His musings were interrupted when a familiar voice cut through the hum of the cabin, its sharpness piercing the quiet. "Sir, are you sure this is your seat? Could I see your ticket again?" Isaac's eyes flicked upward, meeting the cold gaze of Carla, the lead flight attendant, who had appeared at his side seemingly out of nowhere. Her tone was sharp, and her expression was anything but welcoming. She held the passenger manifest in one hand, scanning it briefly before focusing once again on Isaac. The question was simple, but it carried weight, a suggestion of doubt, an implication that he might not belong where he was sitting. Isaac didn't immediately respond, instead extending his boarding pass without a word. His fingers brushed against the edge of the paper, a subtle motion that contrasted with the tension in the air. He wasn't sure why Carla had singled him out, but he had learned long ago that these small moments often held more meaning than they appeared. Carla took the ticket, her eyes quickly flicking over the printed details. But instead of handing it back immediately, she studied it for far longer than necessary. Her lips tightened, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. Isaac could see the small tension in her jaw, the way she was clearly scrutinizing every word on the pass, as if trying to find something, anything, to justify her questioning. "What have they done?" "Interesting," she muttered under her breath, barely loud enough for Isaac to catch the word. It was spoken with a tone that was anything but neutral, a quiet judgment hidden behind the carefully chosen syllables. Isaac didn't flinch. He simply kept his eyes on her, his expression composed, though his mind churned with the unspoken thoughts between them. After what felt like an eternity, Carla handed the ticket back to Isaac, her movements deliberate and slow. The moment lingered for just a second longer than necessary. She sighed, an exaggerated release of breath that seemed to carry the weight of her own frustration. "All right," she said with an air of finality, "but next time, check your seat properly before sitting down." Her words dripped with condescension, as though she were speaking to a child who had made a mistake. There was no apology, no hint of courtesy in her tone. Instead, there was an unspoken assumption that Isaac, as a lower-class passenger, had made a mistake by sitting in the wrong place. That assumption stung, but Isaac remained outwardly calm, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of showing how deeply the slight had pierced. He tucked the boarding pass into his pocket and leaned back in his seat, feeling Carla's gaze lingering just a moment longer before she moved on to the next passenger. Her eyes swept across the cabin, and Isaac knew without looking that she would not spare him another glance. Her suspicion and judgment had been firmly cast in his direction, and there was little left to prove. As Carla disappeared down the aisle, Isaac let out a slow breath, his fingers tracing the edge of the armrest. The air felt heavier now, charged with an electric undercurrent that threatened to spill over. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of the cramped seat, or the incessant hum of the cabin's machinery. It was the recognition of what had just occurred. He had been seen, or rather, he had been assumed. His choice to sit in economy, to blend in as an ordinary passenger, had already triggered a chain of events, small, subtle, but unmistakably telling. The crew had made their judgment, and that judgment was rooted in the surface-level assumptions they clung to about who he was. He had already seen it in the agent's fleeting glance at his shoes, in the disdainful hesitation at the boarding gate, and now in Carla's cold dismissal. The small indignities were adding up. Isaac clenched his fists, but only briefly, before relaxing his grip. There was no point in reacting now. The mission had already begun, and each moment of discomfort, each glance of disapproval, was simply part of the experiment. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a passenger now, one among many, scrutinized and judged like everyone else. And yet, deep within, a fire was kindling. If the flight attendants were going to assume so much based on appearances, he would make sure they faced the consequences of their assumptions. This was more than just a test of the airline's service. It was a test of their values. He wouldn't let them off the hook so easily. The pre-flight preparations had begun in earnest. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, securing overhead compartments, checking seat belts, and ensuring everything was in order before takeoff. Isaac settled deeper into his seat, observing the crew as they worked, his gaze shifting from one flight attendant to the next. He couldn't help but notice the way they interacted with passengers, the sharpness in their gestures, and the subtle nuances in their expressions. Carla, the lead flight attendant, was still moving up and down the aisle, clipboard in hand, her professional facade intact. But as she passed by Isaac's row once again, he noticed her exchange a brief but pointed glance with Mark, the younger flight attendant. He was leaning against the bulkhead near the galley, idly checking his watch, and when their eyes met, Carla's lips curled into a small, knowing smirk. Isaac's instincts immediately told him something was amiss. It was in the way they looked at each other, the quickness of their interaction, and the almost imperceptible shift in their body language. He turned his attention back to the scene unfolding, attempting to appear disinterested, but his ears remained sharp, catching every word of their whispered conversation. Carla leaned toward Mark, her voice low but sharp, the kind of tone she had used earlier with Isaac. "Row 19, Seat D. Can you believe that guy?" she murmured, her words deliberately hushed as though she didn't want anyone else to hear. But Isaac, ever alert, caught the disdain in her voice, the thinly veiled judgment seeping into every syllable. Her smirk widened ever so slightly as she spoke, clearly enjoying the moment of superiority, as if she were sharing a private joke at the expense of a passenger she had already deemed unworthy. One of the great things about exercise, she'd been told. Mark, standing just a few feet away, snickered softly, a sound that might have been easily overlooked by anyone else, but not by Isaac. "I guess we're lowering our standards," he replied, his voice dripping with mockery, mirroring Carla's attitude. It was a remark meant to be heard only by her, a shared moment of judgment that about Isaac himself. Isaac's chest tightened, though he remained outwardly calm. He didn't react, but inside, the sting of their words was like a sharp jab to his pride. He had known the flight attendants would judge him, but the cruelty of it, the casual dismissal, the unspoken assumption that he didn't belong here, took him by surprise. The words hung in the air long after they had been spoken, a silent accusation that lingered just beyond the awareness of the other passengers. He stole a glance at the passengers around him, noting how they remained oblivious to the exchange. Some were absorbed in their phones, others engaged in quiet conversations, but none seemed to notice the tension building just a few rows ahead. It was as if they were all too focused on their own little worlds to pick up on the subtle undercurrents of judgment flowing through the cabin. Isaac felt a strange sense of isolation, as though he were standing on the edge of the world while everyone else remained blissfully unaware. Despite the discomfort, Isaac forced himself to remain still. He refused to let Carla and Mark see the effect their words had on him. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter, not now, and certainly not in front of the other passengers. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, pushing the rising tide of indignation to the back of his mind. There would be time to address this later. For now, he needed to keep observing, gathering the information necessary to understand how deep the problem ran. A few moments later, Carla moved further down the aisle, her steps brisk and purposeful as she continued to interact with passengers. Mark followed her, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than necessary on Isaac. Isaac returned his stare with a quiet, unwavering glance, silently challenging him to make the next move. But Mark simply looked away, his posture stiffening slightly, as if he realized Isaac was not as easy a target as he had assumed. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but it was now an undercurrent, a subtle force that Isaac knew would eventually rise to the surface. The more he observed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about the service of one flight attendant, or the casual assumptions of a single employee. This was about the culture they had cultivated, a culture where passengers were reduced to categories, those who belonged in the front and those who belonged in the back, those who mattered and those who didn't. Isaac clenched his jaw, determined not to let their words shape his thoughts, but it was difficult. He had spent years building his airline, pouring his energy into ensuring every passenger, regardless of ticket class, was treated with respect and dignity. To hear this kind of casual cruelty, this blatant disregard for that fundamental principle, was more than disheartening. It was a betrayal of everything he had worked for. And yet, despite the sting of their comments, Isaac knew this was exactly why he had come. He had known this would happen, had anticipated it even. These small, insidious moments were the very reason for his undercover mission. Now, he had the evidence. He could see firsthand how his crew behaved when they thought no one important was watching. He had the sense of how they were motivated. As the flight attendants continued their rounds, Isaac knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The plane hummed steadily as it ascended, the roar of the engines gradually giving way to the comforting vibrations of smooth flight. Isaac glanced out the window for a moment, watching as the city below shrank into a patchwork of lights and shapes. He'd always found the view from above calming, but today it only reminded him of the subtle war being waged within the confined space of the cabin. As the flight settled into cruising altitude, the flight attendants began the standard drink service. Carla, once again at the forefront, moved with an air of efficiency as she rolled the cart down the aisle. Isaac observed her closely, noting the way she moved. Calm, poised, but tinged with an underlying tension. She hadn't yet approached his row, but Isaac was prepared. His decision to remain low-key had come with a price. He would have to endure the quiet judgment of her eyes, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could maintain his composure. He shouted. When Carla finally reached his row, he raised his hand politely. His tone was neutral, but the request was simple. "Excuse me, could I have some water?" he asked, his voice steady, but laced with quiet authority. Carla stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes flicking down to his face for a moment, then back to the cart she was pushing. The smile on her face, perfectly calibrated for the other passengers, faltered for just a split second. Isaac could see the small flash of irritation before she quickly replaced it with a tight, rehearsed expression. "We'll get to you when we can, sir," Carla said, her words sharp and clipped. Her tone carried an edge that Isaac could almost feel across the aisle. There was no warmth in her voice now, no pretense of politeness, just a cold, curt dismissal that cut through the air, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers who paused in their conversations to glance in Isaac's direction. He held her gaze for a moment, refusing to flinch. He could feel the heat of the moment building, but he didn't let it show. The others around him had no idea what was happening, and Isaac had no intention of making a scene. Still, the edge in her voice, the way she had dismissed him, stung far more than he had expected. As she moved on, continuing her drink service down the aisle, Isaac noticed the faintest glimmer of a smile tugging at the corner of Carla's lips. It wasn't a smile of genuine politeness, nor the courteous smile of a professional. It was something different, something bordering on mockery. She served other passengers with exaggerated warmth, offering drinks with a smile much too bright, far too sincere for someone who had just dismissed another passenger so pointedly. Isaac's grip tightened on the armrest, his pulse quickening as the unfairness of it all settled deeper in his chest. He had known this moment would come. The subtle cruelties, the passive-aggressive behavior. But now that he was witnessing it firsthand, it was harder to bear than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about a minor slight or passing inconvenience. This was something more insidious, something that spoke to the core of the culture Carla had fostered on this flight. The other passengers, of course, seemed oblivious. Their heads were bent toward the flight attendants, their attention caught by the warm smiles and the fast-pacing rhythm of the beverage service. To them, it was all part of the normal routine. They would never know that one simple request for water had triggered this cascade of subtle disdain. Isaac shifted in his seat, trying to force himself to relax. There was no point in reacting too strongly. Not yet, at least. He wasn't here to escalate things. He was here to observe, to gather information. But the more he watched Carla, the more he noticed the small, demeaning gestures she made toward him. the less he could hold his composure. As the drink cart rolled down the aisle again, Carla's eyes passed over him without so much as a glance. She was too busy serving the passengers in the rows ahead, offering them drinks and laughing lightly, as though the world was nothing but smiles and pleasantries. Isaac's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. He waited. Finally, as the drink service reached his row again, Carla paused momentarily before reaching for the small plastic cup of water he had requested. She handed it to him, her smile still holding the same insincerity as before, but this time she didn't say a word. The brief interaction was enough. Isaac took the cup, nodding his thanks, but he didn't expect a response. As Carla moved on, continuing her service, Isaac's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. It wasn't even just about Carla's dismissiveness. It was about something larger, about the assumptions people made based on appearances, the subtle ways people like him were pushed to the margins, treated like they didn't matter because of where they sat or how they dressed. Isaac took a slow sip of water, the cool liquid doing little to ease the heat building in his chest. The anger and frustration were palpable now, but he held on to them, controlled them. This was his moment to gather evidence. It wasn't time to react, not yet. But deep down, Isaac knew that when the time came, he would confront this culture head-on. The passengers, the flight attendants, they were all part of a system that allowed these subtle insults to flourish, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Not now, not after seeing it so clearly. The cabin was quiet again, the hum of the plane and the low murmur of conversation the only sounds in the background. But Isaac could still feel the weight of Carla's actions, lingering in the air like a shadow. The hum of the plane settled into a familiar rhythm as the altitude remained steady. Passengers had begun to relax, some nodding off, while others were absorbed in their personal devices. Carla and Mark, still busy with the task at hand, moved swiftly down the aisles, pushing the meal carts with practiced precision. The trays, filled with standard airline fare, were being handed out to each row, and the atmosphere in the cabin grew more subdued as the flight continued its steady course. Isaac watched as the crew worked, his eyes flicking from one flight attendant to the next, observing how they interacted with the passengers. The subtle dismissals from earlier had made him keenly aware of the power dynamics at play. And now, as the meal service began, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being deliberately overlooked. Carla, with her usual efficiency, moved toward the front of the plane, stopping at row after row, offering meals with a smile that was a little too wide, a little too warm. Mark followed closely behind her, distributing trays with an exaggerated air of professionalism. It was easy to see how the service was supposed to unfold: smooth, courteous, and seamless. But as Carla and Mark reached Isaac's row, something changed. Their steps faltered for a brief moment, as if they had silently decided to skip over him. Isaac raised his hand, a simple, polite gesture that should have gone unnoticed in the midst of the chaos. Instead, it seemed to trigger something in the flight attendants. Mark, his face briefly softening into a smirk, continued moving past him without so much as a glance. Carla followed suit, her eyes sliding over Isaac's row without pause, moving on to the next passenger without a second thought. Isaac's hand remained raised, his patience fraying at the edges, but he kept his face composed. He waited. As the meal service continued down the aisle, his frustration grew, but only in small, contained waves. He could feel the shift in the air, the crew's attention fixed on everyone but him. It was subtle, but undeniable. He wasn't part of the group they considered worth serving. Finally, when the meal cart had passed several rows, Isaac decided to speak up. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the air. "Excuse me," he said, catching Mark's attention. "I haven't been served yet." Mark didn't stop. His gaze never met Isaac's. Instead, he continued pushing the cart down the aisle, offering a nonchalant, flat reply, as if the exchange had no real significance to him. "We're out, sorry." The words were spoken without a hint of remorse, almost dismissive, as if Isaac's request didn't warrant any further consideration. Isaac blinked, his mind working to process the response. Out? He thought to himself. Out of food? His gaze flicked down the aisle where trays of meals were still being handed out to passengers. He saw a woman in the row ahead receiving her meal, a stewardess smiling warmly as she placed the tray in front of her. Isaac's heart sank. The lie was as clear as day. They hadn't run out of food. This was deliberate. The woman next to me had no answer. Isaac held himself still, feeling the stir of anger rise within him, though he refused to let it show. He wasn't here to confront them, not yet, but the snub had landed like a punch to the gut. Mark's insincerity and Carla's deliberate avoidance were too obvious to ignore. There were no explanations, no apologies, just a cold, calculated ignorance of Isaac's presence. The other passengers were still blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. Most were focused on their own meals, conversing softly or watching in-flight entertainment. A few glances were tossed in Isaac's direction, but they quickly turned away, their attention pulled back to their own little worlds. It was as if Isaac didn't exist in the same space as everyone else, a non-entity in a sea of faces. He felt himself shrinking into the background, just another man in a middle seat, overlooked and ignored. Isaac leaned back in his seat, his posture stiff but controlled. The irritation simmered beneath his skin, but he kept it contained. His thoughts churned, analyzing every detail. This wasn't the isolated behavior of one flight attendant. It was a pattern, a deliberate exclusion. They had seen him as an easy target, a passenger who could be ignored, dismissed, and disregarded. He had no title here, no authority, just a nameless face among a crowd of thousands. He observed Carla as she continued down the aisle, now serving another row with an exaggerated smile, offering assistance with the same false warmth she had displayed earlier. Mark followed behind her, moving down the aisle without a hint of remorse. The meal cart clattered softly as it passed. Isaac could almost hear the faint chuckles behind their eyes, the shared amusement between them as they continued their little game. A moment of quiet rage washed over him. But Isaac bit it back, focusing instead on the facts at hand. This was what he had come to see: the culture of indifference, the unconscious bias that had crept into the service. He had heard the rumors, read the complaints, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. There was no place for subtlety in this moment. It was as blatant as the food they were handing out to everyone but him. The meal cart continued down the aisle, but Isaac's mind was elsewhere. He watched as the flight attendants worked, their smiles and words directed at passengers who fit the mold they had in mind. He had become just another faceless member of the crowd, someone who didn't deserve the same treatment as the others. It was a small thing, but in that moment, Isaac made a silent vow. The flight attendants had no idea who they were dealing with, but he would make sure they learned. No one, no matter their status or appearance, should ever be treated like this. Not under his watch. And when the time came, he would make sure Carla and Mark understood just how wrong they were. The cabin settled into a strange, tense quiet after the meal service. The occasional clink of glass and the soft hum of the air conditioning were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Isaac remained in his seat, trying to steady his nerves, the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He could feel the weight of Carla and Mark's behavior still pressing on him. Small acts of dismissal, little jabs meant to put him in his place, but he wasn't going to let it get to him. Not yet. When Carla reappeared, pushing a cart with trays of drinks, Isaac had already resigned himself to another round of service, knowing it might be another opportunity for subtle disregard. She moved with her usual grace, but this time her expression was harder to read, more neutral than before, as though she were trying to mask the disdain that had become so apparent in her behavior. Isaac couldn't help but notice how she kept her gaze fixed on the other passengers, purposefully avoiding eye contact with him. As Carla reached his row, she paused. For a moment, their eyes locked. It was brief, but there was something cold and calculating in her gaze that made Isaac tense. She was standing a little too close now, leaning over to offer him a drink from the tray. Just as Isaac was about to reach for the cup of coffee she was handing him, something unexpected happened. The tray tipped, and with a sudden jerk, the steaming coffee splashed directly onto Isaac's lap. Isaac's body jerked with the sudden impact of the hot liquid. He gasped sharply, the pain from the burn shooting through him like a shock of electricity. The liquid soaked through his clothes in an instant, a hot, stinging reminder of how quickly a moment could turn. "That's hot!" Isaac exclaimed, the shock of the burn leaving him momentarily stunned. He immediately jerked back in his seat, trying to pull away from the searing heat now spreading across his thighs. His pulse raced, and a flicker of panic shot through him as the sharp sting of the coffee burned into his skin. Carla stood there, unmoving, the tray still hovering in mid-air as she watched Isaac's reaction. She didn't seem alarmed, nor did she offer any sign of concern. Instead, her lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. "Oops. Clumsy me," she said, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. There was no apology, no sympathy in her words, just a thinly veiled mockery, as if the whole thing were nothing more than a trivial accident he should have somehow avoided. "You should be more careful, sir." Isaac's mind spun for a moment, the absurdity of the situation hitting him with full force. He had asked for a simple drink, a moment of normalcy in the midst of this increasingly hostile environment. But instead, he was being met with mockery and indifference. The passengers around him shifted in their seats, casting quick, uneasy glances at the scene unfolding. But no one spoke up. No one seemed willing to step in, to challenge the blatant disregard for his comfort and dignity. They were all complicit in the silence. Isaac, though his hands were trembling, forced himself to focus. He didn't want to let this moment unravel him, to let the anger boil over. He wiped at the stain on his pants with the edge of his sleeve, trying to remove as much of the coffee as he could. The burn was sharp, but the more pressing issue now was Carla's cold demeanor. She hadn't even offered an apology, nor did she seem particularly concerned by the accident. "Could I have a napkin, please?" Isaac asked, his voice steady despite the anger churning within him. His words were polite, but there was a slight edge to them now, a quiet demand for basic decency. Carla's expression remained unchanged as she tilted her head slightly, almost as if considering his request. Finally, she gave a small, almost dismissive shake of her head. "We're all out," she replied flatly. "Maybe bring your own next time." Her words were laced with mockery, and the satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable. Isaac could see it clearly now, the faint, almost imperceptible gleam of pleasure that crossed her face as she watched him struggle with the coffee stain. Her attempt at humiliation so thinly veiled it almost bordered on cruel. She turned to move down the aisle, her eyes briefly catching the others as she passed, the faint smirk never leaving her lips. Isaac watched her go, the weight of her treatment heavy in the air. The passengers around him continued with their conversations, their meal, their quiet distractions, none of them seeming to notice how he had been singled out, ignored, and humiliated in front of them. He wiped at the stain again, the fabric of his pants wet and burning, but it wasn't the stain that hurt the most. It was the deliberate cruelty, the way he had been treated as if he didn't deserve any better. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let the tears of frustration well up. There would be time for that later, but for now, he had to focus. He had to stay in control. His mind raced, calculating what he could do next, but in the moment, all he could do was sit there, burning with both the physical pain and the quiet indignity of it all. Around him, the atmosphere had returned to normal. The soft hum of the plane filled the air, and passengers chatted quietly, oblivious to the tension that had just unfolded. No one seemed to notice the thin line of bitterness that hung in the air after Carla's casual dismissal. Isaac looked down at his lap once more, the burn still fresh, still stinging. But it wasn't the burn that drove him. It was the realization of how deeply ingrained this behavior was, how embedded this culture of cruelty and disregard ran. And Isaac knew, without a doubt, that it was time to change it. This wasn't just an accident. It was the moment he had been waiting for. The plane's descent began, the gentle shuddering of the aircraft signaling the approach of landing. Isaac sat still in his seat, trying to steady his breathing. The sting of the coffee burn had dulled, but the weight of the accumulated slights, Carla's mockery, the dismissive attitudes, the insults veiled as accidents, still lingered, burning in his chest. As the flight progressed, Isaac found himself retreating deeper into his thoughts, focusing on the task at hand. He could feel the tension in the cabin, the constant scrutiny that had followed him since he boarded. The plane finally touched down with a soft bump, the wheels skimming the tarmac as the engines whined in the slow process of deceleration. Passengers around him began gathering their belongings, the cabin becoming a chaotic mix of rushing bodies and rattling overhead bins. Isaac watched the scene unfold, his hands gripping the armrests as he mentally prepared for the final test. He had hoped the moment of confrontation would never come, that he could simply slip off the plane unnoticed and complete his mission. But as the seatbelt signs flickered off and the flight attendants began their final duties, Isaac realized the confrontation he had been avoiding was not only inevitable, it was already underway. Carla stepped into the aisle, her eyes scanning the rows, her movements deliberate. As she passed Isaac's seat, she stopped in front of him, her presence filling the space around him. For a brief moment, the noise of the cabin seemed to fade. The murmurs and chatter from the other passengers drowned out as she turned her gaze directly to Isaac. "Sir," Carla began, her voice loud enough to be heard over the rest of the cabin, deliberately drawing attention to their interaction. "We've had several complaints about your behavior during this flight. Other passengers have reported that you were being disruptive." Isaac froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The words struck him like a blow, each one carrying more weight than the last. His mind raced, disbelief flashing across his face as he tried to process what he was hearing. Complaints? What complaints? He had barely said a word during the flight, only asked for a drink, requested some water, and endured the coffee spill with quiet dignity. His body tensed, but he fought to keep his voice steady, refusing to let Carla see the anger building within him. "Complained?" Isaac said, his voice sharper than he intended, disbelief creeping into his words. "I haven't said more than a few words this entire flight." His gaze swept across the aisle, searching the faces of the other passengers. No one met his eyes. Their attention was fixed elsewhere, avoiding the confrontation playing out in front of them. Isaac's pulse quickened. He felt their stares, the judgment, and the sudden sense of isolation that crept into his bones. What was happening? Why were they allowing this? Carla stood there, arms crossed, her face set in an unreadable mask. Before she could respond, Mark appeared behind her, stepping forward with an air of authority that felt forced. His posture was stiff, his arms crossed over his chest as he glared down at Isaac. Isaac recognized the look. It was the same one from earlier, the same subtle cruelty laced in the way Mark had smirked at him, the way he had ignored his request for food. Now, the younger flight attendant was taking the opportunity to add his voice to the accusations. "You were loud, demanding, and uncooperative," Mark chimed in, his tone flat and accusatory. His eyes narrowed as he leveled his gaze at Isaac, as if he had already made up his mind about who Isaac was. It made everyone uncomfortable. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. The words landed like daggers, each one piercing through the calm exterior he had worked so hard to maintain. His mind raced again, trying to make sense of it. Loud? Demanding? Uncooperative? He had barely spoken throughout the flight, had made no demands. His only request had been for water, which had been ignored, and now they were accusing him of being a disturbance, making it seem as though he was the one at fault, as if he was the one causing discomfort. This is, in very real ways, exactly what happened in Doris's school. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers grew louder, a soft ripple of conversation that seemed to intensify as more people turned their attention toward the unfolding drama. Isaac felt their judgment like a weight pressing down on him, their eyes now fixed on him, their opinions already formed, without a single clue as to what had truly happened. It was all playing out in front of him like a sickening performance, and he was the one being dragged through it. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the injustice of it burning within him, but there was nothing he could do. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to gather information, to see the truth of how his airline treated its passengers. And now that truth was staring him in the face. Nick was in constant contact with members of the crew, including Panama. Isaac took a deep breath, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as he tried to maintain control over his racing thoughts. His gaze moved slowly between Carla and Mark, noting the satisfaction in their eyes and the certainty with which they spoke, as though they were convinced they were in the right. "You're lying," Isaac said, his voice low but firm. "You're both lying. I've done nothing but sit here quietly, and now you're accusing me of causing problems?" Carla's lips twisted into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "Sir," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "we take all complaints seriously. We can't have passengers disturbing the peace, can we?" Her words dripped with insincerity, the mockery so clear it was impossible to ignore. Isaac's blood boiled, but he remained silent. What could he say? The truth no longer mattered. They had already made their decision, and no amount of explanation would change their minds. They had painted him as the villain, and he was powerless to stop it. Around him, murmurs grew louder. Some passengers nodded in agreement. Others exchanged uneasy looks, but no one spoke up in his defense. Isaac could feel their judgment, their eyes trained on him as if he were the one at fault. Mark crossed his arms, standing beside Carlo with a smug expression. He didn't need to say another word. His silence spoke volumes. In that moment, Isaac realized this wasn't about justice or truth. It was about power and control. In their eyes, Isaac had none. And the plane began to empty as passengers ready to disembark. But Isaac remained seated, frozen in place. The false accusation hung in the air like a suffocating cloud, and he couldn't shake the weight of it. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point as the murmurs of passengers grew louder. Isaac stood frozen, the weight of the false accusations still hanging in the air. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. But the cold, hard reality of the situation hit him all at once. He had been accused, humiliated, and now it seemed he was about to face physical restraint. As the last few passengers began gathering their belongings to disembark, the door to the cockpit opened with a soft hiss. Isaac's gaze snapped to the figure that emerged, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform, his posture commanding. The pilot, Jackson, stepped out of the cockpit, his eyes immediately locking onto Isaac. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and Isaac could feel the weight of authority in Jackson's presence. Jackson didn't waste time. He strode down the aisle with purpose, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. The cabin, once filled with the low hum of conversation, fell into an uneasy silence as he approached. All eyes were now on him. Isaac felt the judgmental stares of the passengers as they turned their attention away from their own affairs and focused on the unfolding confrontation. "Sir?" Jackson began, his voice low but stern, carrying unmistakable authority. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior on our flights. Security will handle this from here." Isaac opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but before he could get a single word out, Jackson was already upon him. With a swift, practiced motion, the pilot grabbed Isaac's arm, yanking him from his seat with surprising force. Isaac took a deep breath, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as he tried to control his racing thoughts. His gaze moved slowly between Carla and Mark, noting the satisfaction in their eyes, the certainty with which they spoke, as though they were convinced they were in the right. "You're lying," Isaac said, his voice low but firm. "You're both lying. I've done nothing but sit here quietly, and now you're accusing me of causing problems?" Carla's lips twisted into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "Sir," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "we take all complaints seriously. We can't have passengers disturbing the peace, can we?" Her words dripped with insincerity, the mockery so clear that it was impossible to ignore. Isaac's blood boiled, but he remained silent. What could he say? The truth no longer mattered. They had already made their decision, and no amount of explanation would change their minds. They had painted him as the villain, and he was powerless to stop it. Around him, murmurs grew louder. Some passengers nodded in agreement, others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up in his defense. Isaac could feel their judgment, their eyes trained on him, as if he were the one in the wrong. Mark crossed his arms, standing beside Carla with a smug expression. He didn't need to say another word. His silence spoke volumes. In that moment, Isaac realized this wasn't about justice or truth. It was about power. In their eyes, Isaac had none. He couldn't give them what they wanted, and he wasn't ready to let them. The plane began to empty, passengers ready to disembark, but Isaac remained seated, frozen in place. The false accusation hung in the air like poison, suffocating him. He couldn't shake the weight of it, heavy and oppressive. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the cabin mounted as the murmurs grew louder. Isaac stood frozen, the weight of the false accusation still hanging in the air. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened, but the cold reality of the situation hit him all at once. He had been accused, humiliated, and now, it seemed, he was about to face physical restraint. As the last few passengers gathered their belongings to disembark, the door to the cockpit opened with a soft hiss. Isaac's gaze snapped to the figure that emerged. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform, his posture commanding. The pilot, Jackson, stepped out of the cockpit, his eyes immediately locking onto Isaac. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and Isaac felt the weight of authority in Jackson's presence. Ryder's gaze snapped to the figure that emerged upon approaching the passenger ship, an original date. Jackson didn't waste time. He strode down the aisle with purpose, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. The cabin, once filled with the low hum of conversation, fell into uneasy silence as he approached. All eyes were now on him. Isaac felt the judgmental stares of the passengers as they turned their attention away from their own affairs, focused now on the unfolding confrontation. "Sir," Jackson began, his voice low but stern, carrying unmistakable authority. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior on our flights. Security will handle this from here." Isaac opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but before he could get a word out, Jackson was already upon him. With a swift, practiced motion, the pilot grabbed Isaac's arm, yanking him from his seat with surprising force. Isaac's heart raced, a jolt of panic flooding his chest as he tried to regain his balance. His hand shot out, pressing against the armrest, but Jackson was stronger, more forceful. He didn't give Isaac a chance to react. The grip on his arm tightened, increasing with each passing second. Isaac's mind scrambled, his body reacting instinctively. "Let go of me," Isaac snapped, his voice a sharp command. But Jackson didn't relent. The pilot's face remained unreadable, his eyes cold and unwavering. He was a man used to commanding respect, and Isaac's resistance only seemed to fuel his authority. Isaac stared at the phone in his hands. It was the first time since his mother had passed that he'd seen Isaac's face relax. "This is unnecessary," Isaac shouted again, struggling against Jackson's grip, trying to break free. His words felt stolen from him, lost in the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that gripped him. His chest tightened, his breath coming in short bursts as the humiliation began to sink in. He was being treated like a criminal, accused of actions he hadn't committed, and now physically restrained in front of the very passengers he had been trying to protect. The injustice of it was suffocating. "Stop resisting," Jackson said, his voice calm and controlled, "or it'll get worse." The warning hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat that made Isaac's stomach twist. His heart pounded in his ears, the pressure of the situation building. Before Isaac could respond, Jackson swiftly moved to the next step, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Isaac's breath caught in his throat as Jackson cuffed his wrists tightly. The cold metal bit into his skin. The pain of the cuffs, combined with the overwhelming helplessness, sent a wave of humiliation crashing over him. His body jerked involuntarily, the restraints cutting off his movement and making him feel more trapped than he had ever felt before. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the entire cabin were watching, judging him in the most intimate way. Isaac could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, some sympathetic, others curious, but all of them silent. Their gaze was like an invisible weight pressing down on him, and the whispers around the cabin only made the situation worse. He could hear the low murmur of voices, passengers exchanging nervous glances, their attention shifting between Isaac and the flight attendants. Isaac wanted to scream, to lash out, but the reality of his position kept him rooted in place. The cuffs dug into his wrists, a constant reminder of the false accusations, the treatment he had just endured. His pulse raced, his mind screaming for justice, but there was nothing he could do. He was trapped, physically and emotionally, and the only thing left was to endure the humiliation. As Jackson tightened the cuffs, Isaac's head swam. He tried to steady himself, tried to fight the panic rising within him, but the feeling of being completely out of control overwhelmed him. The pain in his wrists was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the sting of the false accusation, of the way his dignity had been stripped away in front of a cabin full of strangers. The whispers grew louder. Passengers now cast quick, furtive glances at Isaac. He could feel their eyes, could hear their judgments in the soft hum of conversation that had overtaken the once peaceful cabin. The whispers weren't kind. They were filled with suspicion, doubt, and curiosity. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others avoided eye contact altogether, their gaze fixed on the window or their phones. But Isaac couldn't escape the reality of the situation. He was in the middle of this storm, and there was no way out. He had no voice here, no way to prove his innocence, no way to fight back. All he had now were the handcuffs, the pressure of the situation weighing him down, and the growing sense of betrayal that ate away at him with each passing second. What the hell? Jackson stepped back, surveying his work with an air of finality. Isaac's hands were restrained, his freedom stripped away in the blink of an eye. The passengers, who had once seemed so distant, now felt like they were closing in on him. The quiet muttering continued, a low buzz of conversation that surrounded him, but no one intervened. No one spoke up. It was as if they were all complicit in his humiliation. Isaac tried to breathe deeply, to regain control of his emotions, but it was futile. The pain in his wrists was sharp, and the weight of the false accusations seemed to crush him from every side. This wasn't just physical restraint. It was the complete dismantling of his dignity, a public display of power and control that had no justification. As the plane continued to taxi to the gate, Isaac's world felt like it had shrunk to nothing. The cabin was no longer a space of neutrality. It had become a courtroom, a battleground where Isaac was the only one who had no voice. The pain of the cuffs was nothing compared to the humiliation, and as he looked around, he knew that this wasn't just an isolated event. This was the culmination of everything he had witnessed on this flight: the treatment of passengers like him, the disregard for fairness, and the casual cruelty that had become so deeply ingrained in the culture of his own airline. And Isaac knew one thing for sure: this fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The hum of the plane barely began to fade as it came to a halt at the gate, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Isaac sat rigidly in his seat, his hands still cuffed tightly, feeling the cold steel digging into his wrists. The whispers around him had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him more heavily with each passing second. His mind spun, a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and helplessness. He had been trapped in a nightmare of false accusations, physical restraint, and humiliation. And now, it seemed, it was about to get worse. As the doors of the plane opened with a quiet hiss, the footsteps of 2 security officers echoed through the aisle. Isaac turned his head slightly, catching sight of them. 2 large men, their uniforms crisply pressed, their presence unmistakable. They moved with authority, boots tapping against the floor as they walked toward the front of the cabin. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke out. None made a move to intervene. Isaac could feel their eyes on him, their judgment still weighing him down. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward first. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, his gaze flicking between Isaac, Jackson, and Carla, before his voice rang out, sharp and direct. "What's the issue here?" the officer asked, his tone flat but not unfriendly. His eyes lingered on Isaac for a moment before moving to the rest of the crew. Carla immediately straightened, her posture rigid as she stepped forward. The air around her seemed to grow colder, her eyes glinting with something darker than mere authority, something almost personal. She pointed toward Isaac, her finger sharp as she spoke. "This man has been aggressive and disruptive throughout the flight," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin. "We had to restrain him for everyone's safety." Isaac's breath caught, his pulse quickening at the accusation. He could feel anger surging within him, threatening to spill over. He had endured so much already. Disrespect, mockery, false accusations, but this? This was the moment where he had to hold himself together. His jaw clenched, and he forced himself to stay calm, controlling the overwhelming surge of emotion rising inside him. "I've done nothing wrong," Isaac said, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "This is a lie." The officers exchanged a brief glance, the kind of unspoken communication that passed between them in a moment of decision. They didn't speak, but Isaac could see the subtle shift in their body language, the way they looked back at him with skepticism and indifference. They had already made their judgment, and there was no room for his side of the story. Carla stood there, arms crossed, watching him with cold satisfaction in her eyes. Mark, standing by her side, had barely moved since the beginning of this ordeal, his arms folded and his expression unreadable. Isaac's frustration burned hotter with each passing second, but he forced himself to breathe through it. The officer who had spoken first, still standing just a few feet away, looked back at his partner. The second officer, a shorter man with a tight-lipped expression, nodded slightly, then stepped forward. His hand was already reaching for the cuffs on Isaac's wrists, the metal glinting as he grasped them. The officer's movements were fluid and efficient, almost rehearsed. They had done this before. To them, Isaac was just another problem to be dealt with, another passenger who had crossed a line. "Sir," the first officer said, his voice softer now but still carrying an air of authority, "we need to escort you off the plane." Isaac's heart raced. This was it. He had been dragged through a nightmare of humiliation and false accusations, and now he was being escorted like a criminal, his hands still bound. The weight of the cuffs felt heavier than ever before, the cold metal a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Isaac wanted to argue, to shout, to force them to understand that he hadn't done anything wrong, but he knew better than to resist now. The situation had escalated beyond the point where his words would make any difference. The officers were doing their job, following orders, taking action based on the lies that had been fed to them, and no amount of pleading would change their minds. As the officers moved toward the aisle, guiding Isaac toward the front of the plane, the murmurs of the other passengers began to swell again. Some leaned forward in their seats, eyes glued to Isaac, while others quickly looked away, avoiding the confrontation. There was no solidarity, no one standing up for him, and Isaac couldn't help but feel the weight of their silence pressing down on him. "Please, I've done nothing," Isaac said, his voice desperate, though he knew it was in vain. "You're making a mistake." But the officers said nothing in response, continuing their steady march toward the front. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming, and Isaac fought back the urge to shout, to demand justice. But as they reached the front of the plane and the doors loomed closer, he knew it was no use. Carla followed them, her expression unchanged, the satisfaction still evident in her eyes as she watched him being escorted off the plane. She had won. Her lies had worked, and Isaac had been cast aside without a second thought. The first officer turned to Isaac, his face impassive as he gestured toward the door. "Please step off the aircraft, sir," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Isaac nodded once, the knot of frustration and helplessness tight in his chest. With one last, lingering look at the passengers, now watching him intently, Isaac stepped off the plane. The cold air outside hit him like a slap to the face. His wrists still ached from the cuffs, but the sting of injustice, the weight of what had just transpired, was far more painful than the physical restraints. As the officers guided him through the terminal, Isaac knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning, and he would make sure that those responsible for what had happened today would answer for it. The cold, sterile air of the terminal hit Isaac like a wall as the officers led him out of the plane. His wrists throbbed with each step, still bound tightly by the handcuffs. But it was the sting of humiliation that hurt the most. His mind raced with everything that had happened, from the false accusations to the physical restraint and utter disregard for his dignity. It was all he could do not to remain calm. The time for restraint was over. He would ensure that everyone involved would face the consequences. The officers led him to a corner of the terminal, away from the main flow of passengers. The clamor of voices, the soft beeping of security scanners, and the overhead announcements created a distant backdrop, but none of it mattered to Isaac now. He was done being passive. He would make sure his voice was heard. He took a deep breath, forced his anger back down, then turned to the officers. "I need to speak to your operations manager," Isaac said, his voice steady but firm. "Now." Stopping in his tracks, he bowed his head. The front desk officer smiled and turned back to his desk. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions shifting subtly as they looked from Isaac to each other. They weren't used to dealing with passengers like him, the ones who didn't fit into their neat boxes, the ones who dared to resist the system. After a moment's hesitation, the taller officer nodded and walked off to find someone. Isaac paced, his mind still reeling, but he focused on the task ahead. This wasn't just about what had happened on the plane. It was about everything. The systemic cruelty, the way he had been treated like an afterthought by his own staff. He had built this airline with his own hands, and now it had been reduced to something unrecognizable, something he couldn't stand by. Moments later, a figure appeared in the distance, walking briskly toward Isaac. It was a man in a neatly pressed suit, his face tight with the same cold authority that had dominated the entire crew. Isaac didn't need to be told who he was. He recognized Thomas Avery, the operations manager, from his briefings and company memos. As Thomas approached, his eyes darted nervously over Isaac, almost as if he didn't want to acknowledge the reality of the situation. There was a brief moment of hesitation before he spoke, his voice strained and uncertain. "Mr. Marshall," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly, as if bracing for something. I had no idea this was happening. Please, allow me to..." Isaac cut him off, his calm demeanor masking the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "Spare me the excuses," he said, his voice colder now, filled with quiet authority. "Bring the crew to me. Immediately." Thomas stammered, his hands shaking slightly as he looked between Isaac and the officers who stood by, the uncomfortable silence stretching between them. It was clear the operations manager hadn't anticipated being confronted like this. Not by a passenger, and certainly not by the owner of the airline. His face paled, the blood draining from his cheeks as the reality of the situation set in. I don't understand, Thomas said, his voice faltering. You're telling me you're Isaac Marshall. Isaac didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He simply pulled out his wallet and removed his CEO ID, holding it up for Thomas to see clearly. The words on the ID were a stark reminder of Isaac's role, not just as a businessman, but as the one who had built the airline from the ground up. He had trusted his team, believed in them, but now that trust felt like a distant memory. Thomas stared at the ID, his mouth going dry. His eyes flicked back to Isaac. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he looked as if he might collapse under the weight of what was happening, his hands trembling as he wiped a nervous bead of sweat from his brow. Mr. Marshall, I had no idea, Thomas repeated, his voice quieter now, strained with regret. Please, let me explain. This is a misunderstanding. Isaac held up a hand, silencing him. There's no misunderstanding here, Thomas, he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. What happened on that plane wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated series of actions, and it needs to be addressed right now. Isaac's mind was racing, but he focused on one thing: accountability. He had to see the faces of those responsible for what had happened to him. He had to make sure they understood the gravity of their actions. He wasn't going to let them slip through the cracks. Not when the integrity of his airline was on the line. Bring the crew to me, Isaac repeated, his tone final, leaving no room for argument. Now, Thomas hesitated for a moment, glancing at the officers who had followed Isaac into the terminal. Then, with a defeated sigh, he nodded. Yes, of course, Mr. Marshall, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll go get them. As Thomas turned to leave, Isaac stood tall, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him. It was about every passenger who had been mistreated, every employee who had been complicit in this culture of neglect. Isaac knew this moment would change everything. This was the reckoning, the beginning of the real work ahead. As Thomas disappeared down the hallway, Isaac remained in place, waiting. He knew the crew was coming, and he knew they would understand the magnitude of what was coming next. The big reveal wasn't just about his identity. It was about exposing the truth, about ensuring that the airline he had spent so much time building would be held to a higher standard. It was time for change, and it would start here. The private meeting room was dimly lit, its walls bare and uninviting, a stark contrast to the tension that had thickened the air. Isaac stood at the head of the table, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Across from him sat Carla, Mark, and Jackson, each of them looking increasingly uncomfortable under his gaze. Carla's usual bravado had evaporated. The smirk she once wore had been replaced with a nervous twitch of her lips. Mark's eyes flicked around the room, avoiding Isaac's stare, and Jackson's stiff posture seemed to betray a flicker of unease. Isaac didn't waste a moment. His eyes locked onto Carla, watching the subtle shift in her demeanor as she realized the weight of her actions. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone she had treated with the same casual cruelty, the passengers who had suffered because of her arrogance and assumption of power. He allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer, his breath steady, the tension in the room palpable. "Do you recognize me now?" "I didn't know, sir. I thought..." Carla's voice trailed off, her excuses faltering before they could take root. She seemed small now, her earlier confidence shattered, her mind struggling to reconcile the man in front of her with the nameless nobody she had treated with such disdain. Isaac cut her off, his voice cold and unwavering. "You thought I was nobody, that I didn't matter. You treated me, and likely others, with cruelty because you assumed you'd face no consequences." The words echoed through the room, each one a reminder of the injustice he had endured. The accusation hung heavily in the air, and Isaac let the silence settle again, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand twitching as though he was about to speak. He opened his mouth, but Isaac was already looking at him, his gaze cutting through the room like a blade. "Mr. Marshall, it was a misunderstanding," Mark began defensively, but his words lacked conviction. Isaac shook his head slowly, his disappointment palpable. "The only misunderstanding here," Isaac replied, his voice rising with quiet fury, "is why you thought this behavior was acceptable." He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. His movements were deliberate, every action a reflection of his growing resolve. The weight of the moment bore down on him, but it did nothing to diminish the strength of his conviction. Isaac's eyes swept over the room, taking in the faces of the crew members who had, just moments ago, seemed so assured in their power. Now they looked like children caught in a lie, their eyes shifting away, unable to meet his gaze. He raised his voice, the words coming out with force and clarity. "Effective immediately, you're all terminated. And trust me, this isn't over. I will ensure no passenger ever endures what I went through today." His words rang out in the room, each syllable deliberate, punctuated by the certainty of someone who had finally found their voice, someone who had fought through the worst to reach this moment. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The three of them sat there, visibly shaken, unable to speak, their mouths agape. Carla's eyes darted nervously between Isaac and the floor. Mark's shoulders slumped, and Jackson's stern face faltered for the first time since the moment he had stepped onto the plane. They had believed they were untouchable, protected by their position, their assumption that they were above accountability. But now, in this small, private room, their world had been turned upside down. Isaac didn't feel triumphant. He felt something more profound, something that went beyond the immediate satisfaction of their termination. He had confronted them, yes, but the true work had only just begun. What he had witnessed was a reflection of a larger problem, an environment where passengers were treated with disdain, where staff could act with impunity, and where a culture of cruelty had been allowed to fester unchecked. This wasn't just about personal vengeance. It was about changing a system that had allowed these behaviors to continue unchecked. As Isaac turned to leave, his hand resting briefly on the doorknob, he paused for a moment. He glanced back at the crew, who had yet to move, still reeling from the weight of their own reckoning. "I hope," Isaac said, his voice softer now, but still carrying heavy weight, "that you'll think about what happened here today. Not just because of the consequences for you, but because of the people you hurt along the way." The room was still as he stepped out, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the crew to face the aftermath of their actions. Outside, in the corridor, Isaac felt a quiet sense of resolve settle within him. He had taken the first step, but the real work was yet to come. He would ensure that his airline, the one he had worked so hard to build, would reflect the values he believed in, values of respect, fairness, and dignity for every passenger who walked through its doors. As he walked away, Isaac's thoughts turned to the passengers who had silently endured what he had experienced. How many others had been treated like this without ever having the courage to speak out? How many had felt powerless, invisible, just as he had? Isaac knew the journey ahead would be long, and the path would not be easy. But he was resolved to make change, to ensure that no one would ever be made to feel small again. End of section 1. The echoes of the confrontation still reverberated in his mind, but as he walked toward the exit, one question lingered, unanswered but not forgotten. How many more would it take to stand up before real change was finally made? As Isaac exited the meeting room and the door closed softly behind him, he felt an overwhelming weight lift from his shoulders. Yet, a deeper sense of purpose took its place. The tension from the confrontation still buzzed in the air, but his mind was no longer clouded by anger or frustration. The moment had passed, and with it, the initial rush of justice. What remained was a clearer vision of what needed to be done next. He could still feel the burn of false accusations, the sting of humiliation. But it was no longer about him. It was about something much larger. And even though it was hard, he walked slowly through the terminal, the hum of activity blending into distant background noise. The hustle of passengers, the announcements overhead, the shuffle of luggage, it all seemed muted as he moved through the crowded space. The weight of his actions settled within him, heavy but not burdensome. He had done what he needed to do, but the journey was far from over. His eyes wandered over the people around him. Families rushing to catch their flights, business travelers lost in their phones, tourists snapping pictures of the terminal, and somewhere among them, Isaac knew, were the countless passengers who had experienced the same neglect and mistreatment he had. People who had been ignored, belittled, or worse, and who had no voice to fight back. The thought weighed heavily on him, but it also fueled him. Isaac stopped near a large window, the glass reflecting his tired face. He let out a slow breath, feeling the cool air of the terminal wash over him, a brief moment of stillness before he stepped back into the fray. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew this moment would mark the beginning of something bigger. Looking out over the busy terminal, Isaac made a silent promise to himself and to everyone who would come after him. Change begins here. End of section 31. He didn't speak the words aloud, but they resonated in his mind with the force of a vow. It wasn't just about the people in the meeting room or the confrontation that had just unfolded. It was about transforming the culture, the very soul of his airline, into something worthy of the values he had always believed in: fairness, respect, and dignity for all. He couldn't undo the past, but he would make damn sure no one would ever suffer the same way again. The path ahead would be difficult, he knew. The road to real change was long, and the forces resisting it would be formidable. But for the first time since this ordeal had begun, Isaac felt the clarity of purpose that would guide him through it. The battle was just starting, but he was ready for whatever came next. As he turned away from the window and made his way toward the exit, a quiet resolve settled within him. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. And with that, he stepped forward, his steps firm and certain, knowing that he was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or treated as though they didn't matter. Change had begun, and it would not be stopped.